We're going to be talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald in the 1920s. Tell me some things about F. Scott Fitzgerald. A couple of you have already mentioned he's concerned with things like wealth, with fame, with what else?
Social rank.
Social rank, social class, yes.
Loss of morals.
Good, the loss of morals, exactly. This sense of a loss of morality, a loss of faith, this sense of being a lost generation after the war and sort of having to figure out what life is all about, completely anew. So those are things that we're going to see in the novel we're going to look at too. Fitzgerald only lived to be about 44 years old. He was a strikingly handsome figure, as you can see. His works became popular overnight, and so he really lived a life in the limelight. He published This Side of Paradise, the novel we looked at here, in 1920. Then The Beautiful and the Damned. Notice the first one was when he was only 24 years old. Then The Beautiful and the Damned, The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night, The Last Tycoon. He spent much of the last decade of his life working in Hollywood on film scripts. And he still has a kind of cultural significance. This is a bar in Paris that is dedicated to F. Scott Fitzgerald. Has this photograph when you first walked in. It's apparently his favorite bar when he was there in Paris. And at the time, he was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. That was like the leading popular magazine at the time. So he had a kind of prominence that I can't think of any contemporary writer who has that. Any contemporary novelist who, is just constantly on television and appearing in the popular media in this way.
J.K. Rowling.
Maybe J.K. Rowling, okay. Maybe there are a few people, but not many. Now, This Side of Paradise is a coming-of-age novel. Amory Blaine is his hero. It's highly autobiographical, and so it parallels his own history at Princeton. Blaine goes to Princeton, then he goes off to war, then he comes back to Princeton, and that makes it sound like, gee, nothing much happens. But in fact, all sorts of things happen to people around him that help shape it. His mother dies, for example. His mentor, Monsignor Darcy, dies. Several friends die, and one disappears altogether. Nobody knows what happens to him. The girl he loves dumps him to marry a rich man she doesn't love. That was really happening to Fitzgerald at the time. He was very interested in Zelda. Zelda dumped him because this rich guy proposed marriage to her, and she said, okay, goodbye, F. Scott. But then that didn't work out, and he and Zelda ended up getting back together and married. But that's after the novel ends. Anyway, another girl is very interested in him, and he and her until she turns out to be completely crazy and drives his car off a cliff. I mean, really, like suicidal crazy, not just sort of, a little weird crazy. So anyway, he has a lot of difficulties. When he submitted the novel, he wrote to his publisher that the title comes from lines of Rupert Brooks. Well, This Side of Paradise, there's little comfort in the wise. And another epigraph is from Oscar Wilde. Experience is the name so many people give to their mistakes. Now, I want you to think about those mottos for a minute. What do they say? This side of paradise, there's little comfort in the wise. And here, experience is the name people give to their mistakes. Say more about that. Contrast? What kind of contrast? Well, what's the first one saying? This side of paradise, there's little comfort in the wise. That's an odd phrase, right? No, come on. Explain. What does he mean, there's little comfort in the wise?
That people justify their mistakes.
Good. Yes, experience is the name you give to your mistakes. And so what are you doing? You call yourself wise when you've had experience, but the fact is, you aren't really wise. There's little comfort in that. Mostly you've just screwed up a lot. And so one way of reading this novel is, Avery grows up. Avery gets wise. But another way of looking at it is, Avery makes a lot of mistakes. A lot of bad things happen around him. It changes him. Is that wisdom? Or is that just the name he's giving to his mistakes? If you want to focus on a contrast, maybe that's what you have in mind. Is it wisdom, or is it just a bunch of mistakes that we've experienced? There's an old joke. Somebody says, hey, you seem to be so smart. You're so wise about things. How did you get to be so wise? The guy said, well, from experience. The guy said, well, where do you get experience? I didn't tell this right because the punchline, that makes no sense. Yeah, okay, I got it now, right? Yeah, Roy's just looking down like, oh, God. Yeah, there's no point in trying to recover from this. It's not going to be funny now. But anyway, he basically says, yeah, you seem to be so wise. So how do you get wisdom? He says, wisdom comes from good judgment. How do you get good judgment? From experience. How do you get experience? Bad judgment. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to go. Well, yeah, what you call wisdom is often just a series of bad judgments, and maybe you've learned something, maybe not. So I think the point is, really it's meant to be an open question, whether Amory Blaine is accruing wisdom through this series of experiences, or whether he's just changing. And yeah, he just calls his mistakes experience and calls that wisdom, but really there's not much wisdom to it at all, it's just stuff that happened. So, at one point, Amory is talking, in this case he's talking to various friends of his at Princeton about the war and about pacifism, whether it's legitimate to go to war. It's on the occasion basically of the outbreak of World War I. And he says, I get to the end of all the logic about non-resistance in the arguments of some of his friends for pacifism. And there, like an excluded middle, stands the huge specter of man as he is and always will be. So in this case, I think it's not really a point about pacifism or the legitimacy of war or anything like that that really is the crucial issue. It's that it forces you to face, like any other moral issue by the end of the novel, forces you to face a basic question, a basic divide, something about the nature of human beings ourselves. He says the specter stands right beside the one logical necessity of Tolstoy's and the other logical necessity of Nietzsche's. Now, what on earth is he talking about? What logical necessity of Tolstoy and what logical necessity of Nietzsche? Yeah, the next slide won't help you. Tolstoy, War and Peace, Anna Karenina. Actually, we haven't read Tolstoy, but we've looked at Dostoevsky. Very similar themes, very similar writers. What, in the end, is the solution for Dostoevsky, for Tolstoy? Yeah.
Was it that you need God to have morals?
Exactly, you need God to have morals. So on the one side, you've got this sort of question about pacifism and war, or really about any other moral question, depending on religion, depending on God. And so Dostoevsky and Tolstoy will say in the end, you can't make sense of these questions without God, without religion. And yet, on the other hand, this argument of Nietzsche's. And what's Nietzsche's position?
There is no morality.
Well, yeah, there is no morality. In a way, they agree, don't they? It's just that, basically, they're both saying, yeah, without God, there's no absolute morality. And so Tolstoy and Dostoevsky say, so we need God. And Nietzsche says, so down with morality. But he sees this as more as an opposition, because Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are saying, on the one hand, yes to God and yes to morality. Nietzsche is saying no to both, but is saying, nevertheless, you can define values yourself, right? Here is what my conscience says, he tells us, that all values are to be determined afresh. You are to become the person you are. And so we get this ideal of authenticity. Just be the person you are. Live the way you want to live. Don't look to some external standard. And so the question really here is, if I'm trying to figure out how to live my life and what my obligations are, do I look outside myself to God or to something else? Or do I look inside myself, as Nietzsche says? So it's really, do I look outside or do I look inside? That's the dilemma. And it's something that, well, does Fitzgerald take a side about? Is there any religious conversion in this novel? Does Amory in the end say, oh, the Monsignor, now that he's dead, I realize he had all the wisdom. Yes, I should follow the Monsignor. I'm going to seminary. No, he doesn't say that, right? So he doesn't take that alternative. But does he say then, well, I look inside and I see all of this value, now I understand? As we'll see, he looks inside, but he's not sure what he finds. Anyway, we'll come back to that. If only, he thinks, we could learn to look on evil as evil, whether it's clothed in filth or monotony or magnificence, then maybe we'd understand. So here's his first attempt to try to understand morality and try to think his way through this problem. He says, I don't know what good and evil are exactly, but suppose we understood evil. Maybe if we took an extreme, right? We looked at evil and saw it as evil. We said, what's the utter absence of virtue, the utter absence of good? Maybe then we'd understand. Well, does anything in the novel appear as this absolute absence of good? I mean, you haven't read the full novel, so that's an unfair question. But really, no. Okay? The evils of the 20th century. You might say Lenin's purges, the Red Terror, Stalin's purges, Hitler, the Holocaust, and so on. All of that is yet to come. None of that's happened yet. So he looks around for something that he finds absolute evil, that he can recognize as evil. And he doesn't actually find that. And so he's puzzled. Well, he does then, with many of his friends, go off to war. And he's saying, as he's about to leave Princeton, he's wandering around the campus that evening. He sees the lights reflecting on the pond. He says, what we leave here is more than this class. It's the whole heritage of youth. We're just one generation. We're breaking all the links that seem to bind us here. So he's seeing the war as breaking all the links. Breaking all the links not just in the sense that they have to leave Princeton, New Jersey and go off to Europe to fight, but in the sense that he sees the war as breaking with the past. The war is somehow dividing everybody who experiences it from their whole heritage, from everything about their upbringing, their society, about the past. Yeah?
And, okay, so does this point of view, is that representative of how Fitzgerald thinks? Or is that more about the character, like with the characters?
All right, good question. To what extent is this the character, and to what extent is it Fitzgerald himself? He is writing this, keep in mind, when he's in his early 20s. And so these experiences are very fresh in his mind, and the things that happen to Amory are things that happen to him. It's very easy to see who's who and to trace the connections. So it's very autobiographical. That makes it tempting to just identify them. On the other hand, is that fair? After all, he's describing Amory's states of mind. Even by the end of the novel, are they his states of mind? This may be Fitzgerald looking back saying, I was kind of a fool, wasn't I? Here is how I got to be where I am, and you see some snippets. So even if this is what Fitzgerald was thinking at the time, is it what he thinks now? Maybe not. Imagine that you've graduated from UT, and you're writing a story about your development here at UT, and you describe your state of mind as a freshman. Is that something you're going to endorse as a senior? I mean, maybe. Maybe you'll say, yeah, you know what UT taught me? I'm okay the way I am. I should be the person I am. I read that thing in Nietzsche my freshman year and just said, well, there it is. Okay? And so, yeah, maybe you're just the same and you endorse every feeling you had as a freshman. Or maybe you look back and you think, well, here's how it seemed to me at the time. So I think all that we can safely say is this is how it seemed to the character, and I'm sure to Fitzgerald at the time. This is what he was feeling, I'm pretty sure, as he was going off to war. In 1920, is he now saying, yeah, it really did? That's less clear. And that's something we need to think about as we go through and see whether by the end he's endorsing these various thoughts along the way. Now, there's another philosophical reference, which I think is nice. He says, here, Heraclitus, did you find in fire and shifting things the prophecy you hurled down the dead years? This midnight my desire will see shadowed among the embers, furled in flame, the splendor and sadness of the world. Great writing. But Heraclitus, who is Heraclitus?
Hercules?
That's a Greek god, right? Just kidding.
Well, no, he's not a Greek god, and he's not Hercules, right? This is not another name for Hercules. Yeah, Heraclitus, he comes and he... No, it's not like that. Here, Heraclitus was a Greek philosopher before Socrates, one of the first Greek philosophers, who is most famous for his saying that you can't step in the same river twice. Now, what does he mean? You might think, I can refute him. I go down to the Colorado River, dip my toe in, but hey, look, I did it again! So much for that, Heraclitus. His point is, it's different somehow, right? The water is flowing the whole time. And so you dip your toe in again, it's to different water. In fact, some people have said, actually, you can't even dip your toe in the first time to the same river because the water is flowing as you do it, right? The water is constantly changing. The river is constantly changing. Heraclitus' point is that the world is constantly changing. That's why he talks about fire, about shifting things like rivers. The point is that the world is constantly changing. Nothing is really constant. And so, as he's departing Princeton, as he's leaving for the war, he looks and he's saying, this is breaking all my ties to the past. But then again, the world is constantly changing. Heraclitus, you were right. The world is shifting. And so he's thinking at first, yes, I'm cut off from the past, but hey, the world is constantly changing. In fact, this sort of change, this disruption, is really the nature of the world. That's the way it is. And so his first thought is, he looks at the world and says, splendor, yes, but also sadness. A world that at every moment is shifting, is changing. And so you're constantly losing everything that is really at every moment. You're becoming a new person. Everything around you is becoming new. Exciting, yes. The splendor of the embers that flash but then are gone. The whole world is, you might say, dying out as you experience it. Heraclitus had this view. There are a few other Western philosophers who have had this view. Mostly this is the view that you find in Buddhism, though. This is the dominant Buddhist view of the world. Things last as long as one thought. Every object is really momentary. The world is constantly changing, constantly shifting. So if you want to see people really develop this idea, we have fragments of Heraclitus, but in Buddhist philosophy you see a great deal of development. In any case, by the time you get to the final chapter, Amory is, there Fitzgerald is with his wife Zelda, by the way. You see him talking about a loss of faith of the heirs of progress. Here is, I think, how Eliot and Yeats are different from Fitzgerald, even though there are a lot of similarities. We've got, yes, this sense of a loss of faith in all of them. But in Fitzgerald, he sees himself as the heir of progress. He doesn't give up on that Enlightenment idea of progress. We've talked about that commitment to truth, to knowledge, to reason, and ultimately to progress. And he's willing to cling to that. He sees progress as something that he is the heir of. There's a sense in which in the United States in the 1920s, he feels like, look, I'm a very lucky guy. Here I am at Princeton in 1920, or really during the war years, a little bit before that era of prosperity that was to dawn. But he still says, look, I realize I'm the heir to a great civilization. A lot has been given to me. And I'm not rejecting it, and I'm not saying it's all dead. I'm given nothing but a bunch of broken images. No, he says, I've been given something very valuable and wonderful, but I also have lost any faith in it. You might say, the ideas that went behind it, I don't have. I have this system that produces prosperity and progress around me, but I'm no longer in a position to understand it. I wasn't left the ideas. I wasn't told how it works, sort of. I was given this great gift, but I wasn't given the manual. So, he feels this sense of moral drift, and he does this little question and answer with himself. Where are you drifting? Don't ask me. Don't you care? Rather, I don't want to commit moral suicide. Have you no interest left? None. I've no more virtue to lose. He was wrong about that, but just as a cooling pot gives off heat, so all through youth and adolescence we give off calories of virtue. That's what's called ingenuousness. In other words, cleverness, really. The idea is, what makes you appear clever and cool and with it when you're young? Basically giving off calories of virtue. Okay? You're probably brought up to be pretty virtuous by your parents, and then you're subject to all these other influences and you start giving off calories of virtue. I.e., yeah, suppose you want to act cool. How do you do it? Do you go to the PCL and study? I mean, that's what I do. What do you do? Do you like help old ladies across the street? Do you volunteer at the Red Cross? Or at Manos de Cristo, or something like that? What do you do?
Hang out with friends.
Hang out with friends? What else?
Get drunk.
Get drunk? Yeah, a bunch of things that are kind of giving off calories of virtue, right? That aren't like accumulating virtues, they're kind of giving it away. So it feels like, yeah, all right, I've lost my innocence. I was brought up to be a pretty good person, and I feel as if in trying to be cool and trying to be clever, I've been sort of losing it all the way along. So, are you corrupt? I think so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about good and evil at all anymore. So at a certain point in the novel, Amory admits, I don't understand good and evil at all. I've been given this great gift. I don't have the user's manual. I don't know how to really understand how it works. I don't understand what good and evil are, what I ought to do. I don't know what virtue is. I really have no idea about any of this anymore. How should I live my life? I have no idea. And he says, I love this line. I don't want to repeat my innocence. I want the pleasure of losing it again. So it's not like, oh, if only I could go back to my childhood ways. That's kind of the Kipling-esque thought. Stop giving off those calories. Go back to what worked. So no, look, I'd like to be back there just so I can lose my innocence again. So here's what he says near the end. He says, there were no more wise men. There were no more heroes. In other words, he's looking around for somebody to say, they've got it figured out. They understand how it all works and what kind of life to lead. And he can't find them. Where are the wise men? Where are the heroes? Bern Holiday, a good friend of his, was sunk from sight as though he had never lived. That's the friend who disappeared. Monsignor, his mentor, was dead. Amory had grown up to 1,000 books, 1,000 lies. He had listened eagerly to people who pretended to know who knew nothing. So he looks around and says, who understands it? Who's got it figured out? Who can I follow and imitate? Aristotle had said, here's how you become virtuous. Find somebody to imitate and imitate them. Start developing those habits in yourself, and when they're second nature, you've got virtue. He says, who do I imitate? I can't find anybody to imitate. I don't find any wise men, no heroes. Basically, I have nobody to look to. Nobody seems to know anything. Life was a damn muddle. A football game with everyone offside and the referee gotten rid of, everyone saying the referee would have been on his side. Maybe you've played in games like that. I played on a philosophy department softball team in graduate school, and it was just like that. There was no umpire, and so we got into big arguments. I remember one time, Jack, a friend of mine, hit this long fly ball. No, actually, it was oh, great. I'm totally screwed up today. I was looking at too many pictures of Calvin Coolidge, and it just destroys my brain. Anyway, yeah, it was the other team, the business school. Guy hit this long line drive, hit a post, a light post, and we didn't know whether it was fair or foul. It was the intramural fields. They didn't have foul lines marked, so we got into this big argument. And so the business school, what do? They negotiate. So they said, we'll call it a ground rule double. And I thought that was going to work out until Jack, this guy, a friend of mine on our team, suddenly said, no, if it's foul, it's a strike. If it's fair, it's a home run. In neither case is it a double. So the business school said, fine, it's a home run. And we lost. In any case, that was all. We always played the referee was on our side, and we always lost the argument. Anyway, he does near the end, however, find something that's a hope of value. He found something that he wanted, that he had always wanted and always would want. Not to be admired, as he had feared, not to be loved, as he had made himself believe, but to be necessary to people, to be indispensable. And so he's thinking, maybe really I've been trying to be cool, trying to be clever, just because I want people to like me. That's a kind of depressing thought. Then he thinks, well, maybe I just want somebody to love me. Hence the girls who keep either going crazy or dumping me. But then he thinks, wait, maybe I could be essential to people. And so he has this epiphany, this sudden burst of insight. Life opened up in one of its amazing bursts of radiance. And Amory suddenly and permanently rejected an old epigram that had been playing listlessly in his mind. Very few things matter and nothing matters very much. On the contrary, he felt an immense desire to give people a sense of security. And so all of a sudden he says, wait a minute, something does matter. When somebody's life goes terribly wrong, that's bad, okay? Don't think about grand evils, think about little evils. Think about when friends go through a difficult time, when people have a rough time, when they lose a sense of security, when people lose everything. He suddenly says, wait, there is such a thing as good things and bad things. He distinguishes two types of people. He calls them spiritually married and spiritually unmarried. Some take human nature as they find it, and some are always seeking new systems that will control or counteract human nature. And so I think there's a deep political insight here. Some people say human nature is what it is. We have to deal with it. Others say, no, we can reshape it, we can remold it, we can revise it. In any case, it concludes this way. As an endless stream it went on, the spirit of the past brooding over a new generation, the chosen youth from the muddled, unchastened world, still fed romantically on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statesmen and poets. Here was a new generation shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds, through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty, gray turmoil to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success, grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken. Well, again, it's beautiful writing, but notice, we not only have the all gods dead, all wars fought, he was wrong about that one, but notice this, the endless stream it goes on. This should remind you of the ending of Gatsby. Romantically, on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statements. In other words, what he said right at the beginning, there's little comfort in the wise, experience is the name we give to our mistakes. Those mottos, in effect, he's alluding back to here. It's not just us individually, it's mankind too. What is the experience and wisdom of mankind? Really, it's just the record of our mistakes. Okay? So there's, in a certain sense, we're fed romantically now, here's our wisdom children. We tell our history, and it's just one mistake after another. And so he ends up saying, actually, we end up in this position where all gods dead, all faiths in man shaken. We look to history and just find a series of mistakes. There was no God in his heart, he knew. So much for the root of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy for him. His ideas were still in riot. There was ever the pain of memory, the regret for his lost youth, yet the waters of disillusion left a deposit on his soul, responsibility and a love of life, the faint stirring of old ambitions and unrealized dreams. So notice something does survive and start forming the foundation. We've got something left on his soul, a sense of responsibility. That, look, I can't just shake it off and just say, hey, whatever. No, it's up to me to define this, to live my life in a way that is really mine, for which I can take responsibility. But also a love of life. This is good. Okay? Here's what's really bad, death. And here's something that's really good, life. And maybe if you start there, you can actually build something. So there's a little bit of a sense of hope here, that something is left. We're not really left with complete confusion. He looks around and he says, look, life is good. Maybe if I understand that, I can go somewhere with it. And so he concludes, I know myself, but that is all. So think of that other alternative. If he can't accept Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, he can't place any reliance on an external standard, either a god or any wise men, any heroes, anything really he can find outside himself to serve as a guide. What about looking inside himself? Well, he looks inside himself and says, okay, I know myself. But that's all. He hasn't yet been able to take the step of how to get from that to any kind of guidance, any kind of standard. And so that's the problem that the novel leaves us with, really. Look inside yourself, try to figure out what you value, become the person you are. And he said, well, okay, I kind of understand now who I am, but so what? That doesn't help me. Okay, I know that, but that's all. And so the task for Amory, and for the reader, I think, really is to say, well, all right, if that's it, if you have to find the standard within yourself, look inside yourself, but now what? Come to some self-understanding, great, but what follows from that? And I don't think he means it to be a simple question. It's supposed to be a hard question, right? Suppose you take Nietzsche's route and you say it's inside. That's not actually much of a help, because you're trying to figure out, well, that's the whole problem, right? How do I live my life? What kind of person do I want to be? And so knowing what kind of person I am now doesn't really answer that question. Yeah.
Well, in trying to find yourself, whatever you think that you are, how do you know that's just not something that's been instilled in you from your parents and it's just their voice speaking? That's why it's kind of hard to know who you are.
Good. Excellent question. How do you know who you are, really? I mean, you look inside, and some of that is just going to be the series of mistakes, either your own mistakes or other people's mistakes that have been handed on to you as wisdom, right? Maybe you're not really that kind of person. It's just that you've been raised to be that kind of person. And so what about that past, about that heritage, about what you are now, is something you want to embrace and say, yes, that's who I am, that's part of my identity. And what do you put aside and say, no, that's not going to be part of my identity? What do you embrace and what do you reject out of the heritage you've been given? That's really the problem he's left with. He looks inside and says, okay, I think I figured out who I am. The real question is who I want to be. And I don't know how to get from the first question, who I am, to that second, who I should want to be. So exactly, I think that's another form of this problem. How do I know whether this is really me or whether it's just something I've been handed and is not really ultimately part of me? Yeah.
I have a question outside of this topic, but is he like encouraging mistakes, or is he saying that they're bad? Like, because he starts off saying like, well, I can't trust the wise since they're just full of mistakes,
Right.
making it seem like almost negative. But he's almost kind of stating like you grow out of the mistakes and you find yourself, I guess.
All right, that's a great question. Is experience something that gives you wisdom, or is it just a bunch of mistakes? Is he encouraging you to go out there and gain experience by making mistakes? You'll learn from it? That's one way to take this. Hey, go out there and yeah, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, but that's okay. Live, make mistakes. Gain the wisdom that comes from that. Or is he saying, yeah, the wisdom, quote unquote, that comes from that? Actually, nothing much comes from that. Just a bunch of mistakes. How do you take this? I mean, notice I'm pulling a teacher trick here. She asked me a question, I'm turning around and asking the rest of you the same question. But actually, I don't think, my own take is Fitzgerald's not really giving us much of an answer to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Either way you look at it, isn't that better than the alternative? That's like, you don't do anything, you then never learn anything.
Ah, okay, good. He does have some friends at Princeton that really just sit in their rooms all the time. And so you could say, I mean, I haven't talked about them because they're boring, they don't do anything. But you might think that's the alternative. To be one of those people who just sits around and doesn't make mistakes, but also doesn't learn anything. Really just sits there and kind of, in fact, there's one guy who seems to be very smart in the novel. Amory admires him. But he really just sits around. He doesn't do much of anything. He reads poetry, but that's about it. And so it's an interesting question whether he's kind of an ideal or whether he's the person you don't want to be like. There's much that's admirable about that character, but nobody, I think, reads the book and thinks, oh, I want to be that dude. So yeah, I mean, one way of looking at it is to say, well, what's really the alternative to going out there and making mistakes? It's that, maybe, but that doesn't seem like a very good alternative at all. All right, well, I have a broader question for you. Why does this whole generation see itself as a lost generation? In Europe, you could say, look, here's why. Because most of the people I went to school with are now dead. And indeed, if you stop and think, 4% of the population dead, but that was concentrated among people of military age, and specifically men of military age, at least in the countries that weren't themselves battlegrounds, like, say, Britain. But if you say, well, wait, 4% of the population overall, that might be like 8% of the male population, and that might be like 24% of the military age male population. Then you start thinking, wait, okay, 1 out of 4 of the people you went to school with, of the people you were friends with and so on, are now dead. All right, that's pretty huge. That is a big impact. In the United States, it wasn't like that. We lost 117,000 people in World War I. That's a lot of people. That's more than twice the number lost in Vietnam. That is, well, take the number lost in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade and multiply by what? 16 or 17 to get that? So it's a lot of people. I don't mean to minimize it. But on the other hand, it's not a huge percentage of the population. It's not like everybody had lost many of their friends in the war. Not in the United States. So why this sense of, all God's dead? All, faith shaken. There are no more heroes, no more wise men. Why that sort of reaction? Yeah.
It's like Pirandello says that whenever something goes bad, you look for someone to blame. And then say, the characters look for the author, to blame the author for all their bad things.
Oh, nice. Okay, good. You look for somebody to blame. And in a way, the problem in World War I is way harder than in World War II. World War II, by the end, yes, disastrous. Who do you blame? Hitler, right? Like most of you just immediately say, I know who to blame, yeah. Now, maybe it wasn't just one guy, but still, you kind of know where to put the blame. It's very easy. There was an aggressor, very clear who was doing bad things and so forth. But World War I, who's to blame? You look and you say, that was horrible, and it's all... Wait, whose fault? Maybe Gavrilo Princip, the guy who shot the Archduke? But wait, I mean, he just shot one guy. So it's hard to fix blame on any one person. And that makes people, I think you're right, they're looking for somebody to blame, but there's no one person to blame, not even some group of people to blame. So they end up thinking it's the whole thing, right? They blame the whole system, the whole set of ideas, everything basically. And so it's this indeterminate sense of things have gone terribly wrong, we've got to blame somebody. Who do we blame?